So I want to talk a little bit more about employment agreements. Many of our executive clients and some of our other clients too are presented with long and often very detailed employment agreements. So, from your experience, can you tell us like the main sections or parts of a standard employment agreement?
Well, it's a good question, although I'm not sure um, the word standard employment agreement really is applicable because
Okay.
in my
Yeah.
experience, employment agreements
Mhm.
range from very simple, really, I was going to say one-page documents. Frankly, an employment agreement doesn't even have to be in writing. It can be an at-will oral employment contract. Come work for me and I'll pay you a salary of $100,000 a year. Okay? Done. Handshake. You now have an enforceable contract. And it can be as simple as that. Now, in that case, you have, at least if you're in Florida, but in most states, that employee, given that arrangement, is an at-will employee. Okay? And the only contractual right he really has, or she has in that case, is to be paid the salary, the agreed upon salary, for as long as that at-will employment contract is in effect. Okay? Now that is, in my view, an enforceable contract in the sense that if that employee works for a period of time, that employee is entitled to be paid his or her salary, again, as long as that contract is in effect. But it can be as simple as that. Oftentimes, an employment contract is stated in an offer letter, a one-page offer letter that says you're going to come to work as, I don't know, director of marketing, let's say, and we're going to pay you a salary of $150,000 per year. You're an at-will employee. You're entitled to these benefits, 4 weeks of vacation, eligible for the health plan, eligible for the 401k. Your hours of work are 8 to 5, Monday to Friday, and sign here if you accept these terms. Now, that's a very simple employment contract, but it's also enforceable in the sense that as long as that contract is in effect, the employee is entitled to be paid at a salary of $150,000 per year and is entitled to the benefits set forth in that contract. But it's an at-will employment arrangement, which means that the employer retains the right to modify those terms on a going forward or prospective basis. And so if times are tough and the employer says, going forward, we're going to reduce your salary to $75,000, the employer is entitled to do that. And the employee can either accept the new arrangement or move on. But that's the nature of an at-will employment contract. So that's sort of at one end of the spectrum. And then at the other end of the spectrum, I would say you have what I call an executive employment contract with the bells and whistles that are normally associated with that. I think that's what you were probably really asking about. But before I get into the bells and whistles, I would just say this. Most employees don't get an executive employment contract, right? The vast majority of employees get something much simpler, either a one-page offer letter or an oral contract of employment, or just something very basic that doesn't really provide much contractual protection other than the guarantee of that salary or that hourly wage for as long as that at-will employment contract is in effect. Now, if you're fortunate enough to have the leverage in the marketplace to demand and get an executive employment contract, that's great. And I represent many executives who are fortunate. Typically, those are high-level, director-level people, C-suite people, or physicians, or high-level executives at big companies in different positions. And they often do have the leverage to demand an executive employment contract. So if they do, and that's great, here's some of the things that I'm looking for, okay? First of all, typically they'll be for a period of time. So as opposed to an at-will employment arrangement, the executive is guaranteed some period of employment so that he can't, I'm going to use a he or she interchangeably, that employee can't get fired, within the first month without some ramifications to the employer. Okay. So typically we're looking at a period of time of, let's say, 1 to 3 years. During that period of time, the employer will always retain the right to terminate the employee for cause. Okay. And if that happens, if the employer has cause to terminate, that means that the employee is out of luck. The employee can be terminated typically immediately without any effect other than the employee loses his job. But if that's the case, and if I'm representing the employee, the executive in this case, I want the cause definition to be defined very narrowly, okay, or as narrowly as possible. So what do I mean by that? I pulled up a sample agreement. This was for an executive I represented. He was CEO of a fairly large company down here, and he got a very nice employment agreement. He had the leverage to demand such an agreement. So cause was defined as, one, an act of fraud or dishonesty by you, which results in the personal enrichment of you or another person or entity at the expense of the company. Two, your admission, confession, pleading of guilty or nolo contendere to a conviction of any felony other than third-degree vehicular infractions, or any other crime or offense involving misuse or misappropriation of money or other property. Or three, your continued material breach of the company's code of conduct or any obligations under this agreement 30 days after the company has given you notice thereof in reasonable detail, if such breach has not been cured by you. So in that case, the executive gets a cure period if he is alleged to have breached the code of conduct. Or four, your gross negligence or willful misconduct with respect to your duties or gross misfeasance of office. Now, I view that as a pretty good, from the executive's point of view, pretty good narrow definition of cause. In other words, he's got to do something really bad to invoke the cause definition, right? And if he doesn't do something really bad, then if the company wants to terminate him, the company will not have cause. It'll be a without cause termination. So what happens in the event of a without cause termination? Well, typically in these executive employment agreements, the executive gets severance pay. Now, that can take a few different forms. That can be either the executive gets paid out for the remainder of the term. That's one possibility. Another possibility is there's a defined amount of pay that the executive gets. I see that more often. Typically, it's 6 months or a year of severance pay. And so the executive has protection from being terminated without cause.